Welcome to our study of Bible prophecy tonight. And as we're looking at Bible prophecy, as we speak, as we're recording this, this is October 11th, 2023. As we're recording this, we're consistently reading in the news about what's happening in Israel, Hamas shelling portions of Israel. And being a pastor, a lot of people have asked me, how does this fit in, or does it even fit into prophecy? And because people ask me, the real answer, the honest answer is, we don't know. But most people won't take that as an answer. They want to know, what is this? What possibly could be this? So I just want to throw out something, and this is my opinion. This is speculation. Because people are asking, I'm giving this answer to the best of my knowledge right now, but don't take this to the bank as this is what's going to be happening. But what I see as a possibility, we know that the next event on the prophecy calendar is going to be the rapture of the church. We know that right after, or very closely right after the rapture of the church, there is going to be somebody that is going to broker a peace agreement between Israel and Islam or other foreign countries. And that peace accord is going to allow Israel to actually start rebuilding the temple, which is going to happen during the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. So what I contend as a possibility, as aggression continues in the place of Israel, couldn't it be a time where, as this fighting is going on and we're hearing about hundreds of people being killed, thousands of people being injured, what would the world think if a man stood up and was able to broker a peace accord right now between Israel and their enemies? People would say, wow, that guy, we better start paying attention to him. He's obviously very powerful, very good at what he does. He's somebody. And so that the more aggression that we see going on in the Middle East leads to even a stronger possibility of a man that is going to come in and declare peace and be successful, that they are able to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount, which is currently taken over by Islam. So I think that there's a good possibility that these could be signs leading up to the rapture, then quickly thereafter the tribulation. However, what I will caution you is this is not the only time that Israel has been faced with aggression. Going back ever since they were a country in 1948, there have been the Six-Day War, 1967, many different times where this scenario could have fit in that as well, and it hasn't. But that also gives people an opportunity to be lulled to sleep. Yeah, we've heard it before. This is just another thing going on. And that, again, could be how it catches people by surprise. So the increase in aggression is actually going to make it look even more spectacular that somebody could come in and cause peace in this area. And the greater that person seems to be, the more opportunity for that person to be the Antichrist. So it could be speaking into prophecy, but again, we can't, don't hold your breath for it, but we will just have to wait and see. But again, it is an opportunity to look towards looking at prophecy and why we should study it. So that having been said, we're going to be looking at Israel today, and we're in the book of Romans. And if you are following along with your Bible, I would suggest that you turn to Romans 11. And so let's take just a moment to look at some background, not very much, but a little bit. Romans 9 was talking about Israel's failures of the past. Romans 10 talks about Israel's opportunities in the present, And now we're moving into Romans 11, and we're going to be looking at Israel's hope for the future. And when we say Israel's hope, I'm actually talking about Jewish people's hope. I'm not looking at, in this case, Israel as a nation. Israel as a nation in the Old Testament was God's chosen. But now, since the days of Christ, God's chosen are individuals, not a nation. He has moved from a nation to now individuals who have to make that decision for the Messiah. So we're going to look at Israel's hope, or I should say, Jewish people's hope for the future if they are saved in the present. I'm going to read chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. I'm going to read those 6 verses, and then I'll go back and I'll start looking at the verses one at a time. So we'll start in Romans 11, and beginning in verse 1. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets. They have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept from myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Verse 5, so too at the present time there is a remnant, chosen by grace. Verse 6, but if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. So let's go back and look at these verses. That gives you an overview. Verse 1, Paul says, I ask then, did God reject his people? And then he immediately answers, by no means. In other words, now he's saying no, and here's the evidence. So has God rejected his people? No. Now let me give you some evidence why I say that. I am an Israelite. In other words, he didn't reject me. So Paul is an individual, a Jewish individual. And he started by asking, did God reject his people? And then Paul said, well, no. Because, hello, here I am. I'm Jewish. I obviously have not been rejected. So, no, the answer is no. God by no means, as Paul says. In verse 2, God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. At least he didn't reject the elect. Because now he's narrowed it down. He started, did he reject his people? And based on what Paul had just been talking about, you're thinking, okay, the Jewish nation. But what Paul wants you to see is that it's now individuals that are either accepted or rejected. It's not a nation. Many people think that they're Christians because they live in America. They may not go to church, maybe their parents were, or maybe they go to church but they've never made any decision or anything like that, and they just consider themselves Christians. Well, that doesn't work anymore, and it has never worked for Americans, and it doesn't work anymore for Jewish, thinking that you're safe, you're in the inside because you are of the Israel nation. And so now he's saying this, God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. So he didn't foreknow a nation, he foreknew people, and he did not reject those people who were elected. Verses 3 and 4, which we read a minute ago, is the account of Elijah, who thought that he was rejected too, but God actually had a remnant of 7,000 believers. I love it when the Bible has a commentary on the Bible. So if you'd have been reading that in 1 Kings, there would have been, what does this mean? But Paul now interprets that, and he uses that. Elijah thought he was rejected. Oh, woe is me, God, you've turned your back on Israel. And God says, what are you talking about? I have 7,000 prophets who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And see, Elijah thought it was all about him. He didn't understand that it wasn't all about him. It's about God and God's sovereignty over to choose and do what he wants to do because he's God. And Elijah thought it was all about him. And so he said, no, there was actually a remnant, and that word was used in Kings, of 7,000. And so Jewish people at the time Paul is talking, don't make the same mistakes. Don't say, oh, there's nobody left but just us. So verse 5 says, even now there are some Jews getting saved. So verse 5 says, so too at the present time, this is when Paul was writing this, at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. So not all Israeli people, not all Jewish people were rejected. The nation was rejected as a whole, but Paul's the first one to stand up and say, I wasn't rejected. So he says in verse 5 that even at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. Verse 7 goes on, what the people of Israel sought so earnestly, they did not obtain. The elect among them did. So again, Paul is separating the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, from the individuals. What the people, the individuals of Israel, sought so earnestly, they never obtained. The elect among them did, and he's going to continue to talk about that. So why does God elect some and not others? As I've been a pastor, and even before I was a pastor teaching Sunday school, people have asked me this question consistently. You have two basic trains of thought, and one is Calvinism, which says that God has elected some people to be saved. And then the other is Arminianism, which says it's free will. It's up to us whether we get saved or not. And that's been a disagreement. And I am a Calvinist, a cautionary Calvinist, I'll put it that way, but I'm a Calvinist anyway that believes that God has elected some. And so people who are free will people say, that doesn't seem right. That doesn't feel right that God would choose some and not choose others. And they want me to explain this. So this question here, why does God elect some and not others? Let's take a look at, see what Paul says here in Romans. I'm skipping up now to verse 11. Again I ask, did they, Israel, nation of Israel, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? And here he says it again, not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, Israel as a nation, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. So that's why. You ask, why did God elect some and not elect some? Okay, here's an answer. We're going to look at it a little bit more in depth. Did they stumble to fall beyond recovery? Well, again, Paul could say, hello, here I am. I'm of the nation Israel. Was I beyond recovery? No, God spoke to me on the Damascus road, and here I am preaching the gospel. So he says, not at all. But because of the transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. So, in other words, it was all part of the plan. God never said, oh, well, I guess that didn't work. I tried to choose a nation and, have them be my people forever, and I guess I picked the wrong nation, or I guess I didn't do something right, or whatever. God never said that. He knew it was part of the plan from the beginning. And this is what we get, dispensationalism. God is not done with Israel. There are some denominations, there are some people that do not believe in dispensationalism. Dispensationalism said there was a time where Israel was God's chosen people. Now, some people believe they blew it, they're done with it, never to be heard from again. That is not the case. It's kind of like a great big giant parentheses. It's being put on hold, and again, through this section, he's going to talk more about that. Did they fall beyond recovery? Not at all. The Jews showed the world that man could not be saved by the law. They gave them the law through Moses. They had 2,000 years to try to be successful at living for God through the law. They could not do it. So therefore, at God's appointed time, why that particular year, I don't know. But when at the fullness of time, when the time came, he sent forth his son Jesus. And so they basically had 2,000 years to show them that they couldn't do it through the law. So now it's Jesus. To make Israel jealous. So why are these happening? To make Israel jealous. So Israel had been the chosen people, and now they're seeing Gentiles being welcomed into the kingdom, sometimes before even Jewish people. And that's why Paul elsewhere says not all Israel is Israel, because Israel is God's chosen people. And what he's saying now is, now it's not a matter of what nation you were born into or come from. You are now part of the kingdom if you believe in Jesus as the Messiah. So he's going to make them jealous. So let's look at a contemporary look or contemporary spin. Let me put it this way, and let's see if you can kind of follow along. Sometimes I try to use an example and I get lost in the weeds and get people off track, but I'm going to try to put this. So it's like the ex-boyfriend with a bimbo on his arm to get the old girlfriend jealous. So think back in your high school days and, the girl is going out with this guy and they break up, and the next thing this guy is going out with this, beautiful cheerleady girl or whatever. Sorry, I didn't mean to pick on cheerleaders, but, this pretty girl that doesn't have a clue, but, she's good looking, and he prances her around to try to get the old girlfriend jealous. And then the girl, but what we have to understand is the girl who lost the boyfriend to the bimbo, the girl will get the right guy and it'll all work out. Doesn't seem it at the time. Any breakup, I don't care what the situation is, what the story is, any breakup can be hurtful and you can't always understand why right then and there. But given time, how many girls have said, dodged a bullet on that one. Boy, if I'd have married him, we'd have been in a world of hurt. And God had somebody picked out for this girl. So so why did God do this? To make Israel jealous. And there can be times where Jewish people, sometimes when they meet with Christians, the Christians saying sometimes, I'm not saying all the time or anything like that, but many times Jewish people are envious as to how well some Christians know their religion better than they do. Even the Old Testament. Some Christians know their Old Testament better than Jewish people do. And sometimes Jewish people, they're chosen ones, but yet these people who are not of that same fold sometimes do a better job than they did. So the Bible says that they were being envious or they were being jealous, depending on which version you have.
Isn't being envious a sin? I thought we were told not to be envious.
And that's why some versions put jealousy in there. Okay. Well, but it's not a sin if you're jealous over, you have an opportunity. If you're saying, isn't envious being a sin? Yeah, but so is not accepting Christ as a Messiah. And so if you're envious over a good thing, then it depends on what the object is. If I see somebody working harder than me, then I may be envious that they're a hard worker. That wouldn't be a sin, but if they get a promotion and I'm envious of them because they got a promotion, then that would be a sin. So again, if you're looking at, this is a good envious type of thing. So God obviously will never cause somebody to sin, but he does want them to be envious and he does want them to be jealous. So So, but if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? So in other words, Israel will finally gain their full righteous inheritance. And so he says, if their transgression means riches for the world, because their transgression was they didn't follow through for the Messiah, what that means is riches for the world. Until Jesus came, Israel was the only chosen people. But now Jesus has come for the whole world. He's not willing that any should perish. So how much greater are the riches going to be with their full inclusion? And Israel is still God's chosen people. They are going to get riches and benefits in the millennium and in heaven that we as Gentiles are not going to get. But I can tell you, at least in heaven, probably not in the millennium, we are not going to be envious or jealous of those things. They're still God's people. They are going to get what God promised, the land. They were given the law. They were given special access to the temple and things like that we'll never get because we were never Jews. So they are still going to get some benefits that we are never going to get. So if their transgressions means riches for the world, but we are going to get the millennium, and we are going to get heaven, and we are going to get salvation, that's the riches talked about here, the riches for the Gentiles. How much greater riches will their full inclusion get? They are still going to get greater benefits than us. If you can, it's like saying that's greater than infinity, and you can't have a greater than, we are going to have such a great heaven and blessings that it won't even seem like it's greater. We'll be so happy. We won't have this sinful nature that always looks at people and says, I want what they've got. They've got more. Somebody asked, I heard this question the other day, and I forget if it was J.P. Rockefeller or somebody had asked one of these like unbelievable rich people, and he said, how much is enough? And that person said, more. In other words, you never have enough. You always want more. But when we get to heaven, we as Gentiles are going to say, this is what you gave us. This is enough. We're happy with that. But the Jews are still going to get much greater riches for the things that they were promised. Verse 24, after all, if you were cut out of an olive tree, so here we're going to be talking about grafting. So Paul says, after all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature and contrary to nature, were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? In case you don't understand grafting, let me kind of explain how it does this. So trees can be grafted in. There are different varieties of apples. They're not different species, but they're different varieties of apples. You can take a Mac tree that produces Macintosh apples. You can make a cutting. You can take a branch of a Cortland apple and you can graft it in. And eventually your tree will grow Macs and Cortlands. They grow together like that. And sometimes they do that to get two different kinds of fruit out of there. And so grafting, plants work like this. Obviously animals don't work like this, but plants work like this. When you can graft something together and both will be their individual. The fruit, the nourishment's coming up from the roots is not going to change the fruit because the fruit is already there and it's going to produce. That's grafting. So he says, after all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature. Now he's talking to Jewish people. And your olive tree is going to be what is producing fruit. We'll say this is the godly olive tree, and quite often the olive tree is a symbol of Israel. So let's say that you were cut out of an olive tree. What happens? when a branch doesn't produce fruit anymore, it's cut off. Anybody that knows anything about like grape vineyards and grapevines and stuff like that, you go through in some, I don't know, flowers, and I'm not much of a horticulturist, but you go through and you cut off the dead stuff. So the energy goes to the stuff that's living, and it makes it sweeter and gives it more nutrition and whatever, more sugar. And so that's why they trim vines. And so if there's a olive branch, that branch, for whatever reason, is not producing good fruit, they're going to cut it off. So it's not taking any energy resources into a branch that's not going to produce fruit. They tell me to do that with my tomatoes. If there's a branch and it doesn't have any buds on it, you cut it off. I think they actually call them suckers. So you cut that sucker off. So it's not getting the energy. The energy is going more into the branches that are producing the tomatoes. Here it's an olive tree. So if you were to cut off an olive tree that is wild by nature, wild olive tree, and contrary to nature, were grafted into a cultivated olive tree. So you go out there in the wild, in a wild olive branch, you cut that off, and then you put it on a cultivated olive tree, which would be your Gentiles. How much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? So in other words, what they're saying is, when Jesus came as Messiah in the year 2000, Israel as a nation were done as far as salvation. Now you are no longer, well, you're still God's chosen people, but you're not going to heaven based on being part of Israel. But yet, through the years, many Jewish people have come to accept Christ as Messiah. So what he's basically saying is, those people are even fuller than Gentiles are. So they're Jewish, they had God's blessing, then it turned over to Gentiles, and now they're of the Jewish nation, but now they've believed in Jesus as the Messiah, so now they even have more blessings. So he says, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? So in other words, some people call them completed Jews, these Messianic Jews. So they are going to be even more blessed, is what he's saying here, by being grafted back in. So the Gentiles will be grafted back in, but Israel too, or I probably should have said Israelites or Jewish people too, will be grafted back in. So those Jewish people that accept Jesus Messiah are going to be grafted back in. So now the question is, when is this going to happen? Thank you for asking me. Verse 25, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. So I want to remind you, we were talking about when is this going to happen? When are Israelites going to be grafted back in? Now they're grafted back in little by little, throughout the years, but there's going to be a fuller grafting. So it's not going to be one branch here, one branch there. There's going to be a fuller. So first of all, he calls this a mystery. Now, Gentile salvation in the Old Testament was not clear. The Jewish people did not, we would call it evangelize, would not go out and try to get people to join Judaism. They didn't do that. It was a mystery to them. They were God's chosen people. Why am I going to go to the Egyptians and try to convince them to become Jews? You don't read that in the Old Testament. Now, if those people came and lived with the Jews, that's a different story. They would have to be circumcised, and they would have to follow the kosher law and do all the kind of stuff like that. But they didn't go out looking for it. It was generally like servants and workers and people like that saw the good. And we see that in, not Esther, but Ruth. Okay, Rahab was one that did that. She was not a Jew, and she saved the nation, Israel nation, saved her and her family, got grafted in, and then also Ruth and Naomi, and they got grafted in. So there were people that did join Judaism back then, but not wholesale, and the Jews never went out to try to do that. So the mystery was the Gentile salvation. The Jewish people it wasn't a thing. They didn't really even think about it, but we see it revealed in the New Testament. So when will it happen? When the full number of Gentiles have come in. The church age is what we're known right now. We're in the age of Gentiles. So right now, since Jesus came, we have been in the age of Gentiles, and God is working through His church. His people is now His church. So the full number of Gentiles, the rapture pretty much closes that door. So in other words, people, Gentiles, have to make that decision right now, because after the rapture, you're not going to have much choice. There will be some, I'm sure, there will be some Gentiles that will get saved during the tribulation, but that's not going to be the focus. The focus of the tribulation is on the Jews, and we'll study that a little bit more tonight, but also more to come. So Israel has experienced a hardening part until the full number of Gentiles has come in. That's the rapture. And now God is going to go back and give one last chance to the Jews who are alive now. The Jews who died in the year 300, 700, 1500, we're not talking about them having a second chance. The Bible said it is appointed unto men once to die and then the judgment. That's Hebrews 9:27. So not those people, but the Jews who are alive at the rapture are going to have one more opportunity. So when the fullness of the Gentiles, that's rapture. Gentiles are taken out, and now the 7-year tribulation period is all about the Jewish people. Verse 26, and in this way all Israel will be saved. I had a big trouble with this for many, many years. All Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob, and this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So the first thing that we want to look at is all Israel will be saved. All is all. It doesn't mean any different here than it does in our everyday speech. When it says all, it means all. Not most, not many, but all. All of Israel is going to be saved? Seriously? Like every person? How can you reconcile that? He's going to tell us. When is that going to happen? After the second coming and the Battle of Armageddon. The deliverer will come from Zion. So this is after the Battle of Armageddon. All Israel will be saved today? No. Tomorrow? No. Okay. It will happen after the deliverer comes from Zion. That's the second coming. That's the Battle of Armageddon. The 144,000 Jews going into the millennium will all be Jews. So the 144,000, so we'll obviously look more about this when we get to Revelation, but the 144,000 that get saved during the tribulation, they are going to be going into the millennium. And Ezekiel 20 verses 33 to 38. So turn in your Bible, if you will, to Ezekiel chapter 20, and starting in verse 33, I'm going to read it. I'm not going to have it on the screen. It's a little bit too long. But here's what it says. So have this in mind. The Battle of Armageddon has just happened. We're about ready to go into the millennium. Going into the millennium, every person is saved because Jesus coming down has just wiped out his enemy, which is anybody who's not saved. So going into the millennium, that first day of the millennium, everybody is saved. People are going to be born in the millennium. Those people aren't necessarily going to be saved, but going into the millennium, he has just wiped out every enemy, so everybody going in is a Christian. And now let's read about that exact same time period starting in Ezekiel. So Ezekiel 20 starting in verse 33. As I live, declares the Lord God, surely with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and with the wrath poured out, I will be king over you. That's the Battle of Armageddon. That's the second coming. I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you out of the countries where you were scattered with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and with wrath poured out. That's calling the people, the Jews scattered around the world, that's calling them back to the promised land. And verse 35, and I will bring you into the wilderness of the peoples, and there I will enter into judgment with you face to face. As I entered into judgment with your fathers in the wilderness of the land of Egypt, so I will enter into judgment with you, declares the Lord God. So remember, these are Messianic Jews, these are believers, so don't necessarily think judgment that they're going to get punished. They will be judged, they will be dealt with, but just like believers, you're not going to lose your salvation, but you are going to be, your works, since you've been saved, are going to be examined. We've already looked at the verses that talk about that. That's what he's talking about here. I will make you pass under the rod. In other words, I'm going to test you. And I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. Now you're going into the covenant. You're getting into the promised land. He's talking to Jewish people here. You're coming into the promised land. And in verse 38, I will purge out the rebels from among you, and those who transgress against me. I will bring them out of the land where they sojourn, but they shall not enter the land of Israel. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So notice that he says, I will purge out the rebels from among you. So none of those Jewish people that are not Messianic Jews are going to enter into the promised land. So when will all Israel be saved? At the beginning of the millennium. There will not be, and not only Israel, but there won't be anybody else because it's all Christians going in. So all Israel will be saved because that first day of the millennium, every Jewish person going into the millennium is a believer in Jesus as the Messiah. So then you could say, and they're still, by heritage, they're still Jewish. And so you can say, that's how you can say all Israel is saved, because nobody but saved people go into the millennium. Many Psalms, as well as other passages, talk about this deliverance out of Zion. And again, this is the Battle of Armageddon. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. Zion is basically, Mount Zion is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a city built on Mount Zion. So many times when you say Zion, it's sometimes considered Jerusalem. Sometimes it's symbolic of the whole nation, Zion. When the Lord restores his people, when the Lord, even the book of Psalms, this is talking about entering into the millennium, because that is when God is restoring his people. Let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. And again, if you're new to following me on this, let me point out why it's Jacob, because even Muslims are descended from Abraham. Even Muslims are descended from Isaac. Some Muslims are descended from Isaac. But no Muslims are descended from Jacob. Those are Israel. Those are the 12 tribes were Jacob's children's. And so when he's talking about here, that's why he doesn't say Abraham, because he wants to point out Muslims are not Christian. I mean, there may be people who formerly were Muslim that accepted Jesus, and they would be saved, but they wouldn't be Muslim anymore. So, but these people are not descendants of generally people that we look at as Muslims. So all Jacob, that's Israel, will rejoice and Israel will be glad. So this is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. Why does God do what he does? Why does he elect who he chooses? Thank you for asking me again, because I'm going to answer that one too. Verse 33 and 34 as we get ready to close out chapter 11. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. In other words, we don't know why God does what he does. Or who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? In other words, we don't know. why God does what he does. The bottom line, here is the bottom line of everything we've looked at tonight. For from him and through him and for him are all things. And to him be the glory forever. Why does he do what he does? Because to him be the glory forever. Why does he decide these people this and those people that? To him be glory forever. Who can search out the mind of God? We have no idea. We just have to look at what he's doing. We don't have to look at why he's doing. It's interesting to speculate and think about, but the bottom line is, who can know? Our brains cannot even begin to comprehend the way his brain works. And the bottom line is, to him be the glory forever. So that's this evening, and next time we meet again, we'll be moving into Romans chapter 14. So thank you for joining me.